US-Bangladesh Advisory Council, we promote dialogue between the US and Bangladesh on a variety of development issues, and we work with Congress and the administration to promote development funding for Bangladesh, as well as greater trade ties and efforts that would essentially promote the center of living in Bangladesh. So any of you in the, here in the room who are part of the diaspora from Bangladesh are welcome to join our efforts in this, in this area of climate change as well. So I'll start off with a quote from Muhammad Yunus, whom all of you know. He said, "What makes a disaster is not so much the size of the physical event, but the inability of the stricken community to absorb it." And I think this is really important because in terms of the size of the event, we see sort of cyclones and floods at a massive scale hit a lot of countries, but when it comes to Bangladesh, the inability to respond is sort of very visible and striking. And one particular example is in '92 there was a hurricane in Florida, and there was a similar size hurricane in Bangladesh in '91. The death toll in Florida was 26 deaths compared to 138,000 in Bangladesh. So if you just compare, by scale, which also brings me to some of the equity issues of what the developed countries can do to promote development in countries like Bangladesh, where I think somebody else said earlier, most of the population still lives below $2 a day. As you've heard, one of our main problems is the topography, and we've heard from scientists and geologists in the room about what we can do to sort of remedy some of the issues related to that. But just on the ground, I've seen some of the impacts myself. The water is kind of coming into the coastal areas. And a lot of the farmers who are right now promoting crops in these areas are being affected because of the salinity levels and just in general the lack of agricultural land going forward. And on top of that, some people are having to move all the time. There's one family that I've spoken to that had to move their house 4 times just to go inland. And I think somebody else has mentioned the whole stress on the cities in Bangladesh too, because people are moving into the cities, and that's another whole challenge that we're having to deal with. And then we've also not talked as much about the public health impacts. There's greater dysentery and jaundice and a lot of public health concerns that are really coming to the fore as a result of climate change. So when we talk about adaptation, it's not just sort of building seawalls and just alternative sources of agriculture, but it's also a lot of other things that we've talked about, the impact on gender, which the previous speaker talked about, the impact on women and children especially, but also public health. What can we do to sort of really improve the infrastructure to deal with these issues? And in the meantime, the government has, in fact, published the National Adaptation Plan of Action. This was a while ago, but the fact remains that a lot of these great plans have not been funded. Which brings me to sort of what the international community is doing, because on the one hand, we also need to sort of get our own houses in order, and Bangladeshi politicians need to sort of have a united front and so on and so forth. But can we say that the international community has really sort of put forward the resources that it needs to? The Bangladeshi plan actually includes a stress on food security, infrastructure improvement, and capacity building. And within capacity building, it actually mentions a variety of programs that we've talked about, focused on women, focused on agriculture. But the funding issue remains kind of a question mark for a lot of these programs. And in terms of what the people are doing, some of the things that we've seen ourselves, there are some people who are resorting to community-based adaptation programs, and some of you may know what that means, but for one example would be where one community is creating out of water hyacinth plants these sort of baskets that they're using to float food and rice and fish to keep them dry. So as the water level rises, they're able to sort of preserve their food and the quality of their food. And they're also sort of using the same kind of mechanism to create gardens, sort of bigger gardens where they actually plant crops that actually move up with the water level. And on top of that, they're also increasing the elevation of their own houses with bamboo and logs and so on and so forth. So it's all very sort of makeshift. People are kind of coming up with very innovative solutions, and I'm always surprised by the tenacity and the creativity of these people. But I think all of us know that longer-term solutions are needed. The government needs to really step up. The international community needs to step up. And as far as the burden on the country's development budget, right now we're spending about $100 million from our own budget to tackle some of these issues, but there's an estimate that the government gave itself, as well as the World Bank has certified this estimate, that 5 years of work leading up to about 2016 would require $5 billion. So it's not small change, and there needs to be sort of a lot more efforts to happen to really sort of make the funding materialize. And in the international context, we've seen the talks in Copenhagen and also in Cancun, the UN Framework for Climate Change a while ago, even before Copenhagen, and the Earth Summit in 1992, they made the developed countries sign an agreement that they would in fact provide funding for climate change adaptation. The Annex 1 countries, US, Japan, Canada, Australia, Russia, and much of Europe, they all signed this agreement. And they also said that they would provide between 40 to 170 billion to the countries that are most in need, which are very big numbers. We haven't seen as much really come forward. And in terms of the costs of climate change, itself, we're not just talking about the lost livelihoods from the floods and cyclones or the disease burden only. We're also talking about or even the loss of agricultural land, but there are also some short-term things that initially were overlooked, like, for instance, tourism for countries like Maldives or Bangladesh. So they realized later that the cost is actually much bigger because, some of the revenue actually comes from tourism in these areas, in the Sundarbans, and those were actually underestimated in calculating the cost of climate change. So, in fact, we need about $5 billion for 5 years, and it needs to be obviously streamlined and used effectively, but the price tag is actually rather large. As far as the U.S. goes, the response has been kind of lukewarm. We've seen, I'm actually understating a lot of this, but Secretary Clinton has said that we should focus on this. And at the level of administration, there have been sort of a lot of focus on doing something about climate change. But in terms of Congress, we haven't seen as much leadership. So that's where really things need to change. I think all of you are very familiar with that. So while the Republicans and the Democrats are fighting over some of these things, and people are actually seeing on-the-ground impacts in Bangladesh of climate change. But even in terms of the Copenhagen summit, Todd Stern, who's the chief negotiator for climate change, I'll sort of give you a quote that he himself came up with in the last meeting. He said, "It's absolutely ridiculous that the U.S. should have to compensate poor countries, because when the U.S. was running air conditioners and building inefficient cars in the 60s, we did not know about the impact on the climate." But I think that, Mr. Stern, being a lawyer, he should know that in the court of law, damages are damages. So even though the intent wasn't to damage the environment, the burden should really sort of fall on the rich countries to compensate the poorest countries. And in terms of some of the hard funding numbers, and if you want, whoever's interested, I can send some of you the actual tables where these figures come from. But from 2001 to 2009, the rich countries pledged about $18 billion, but provided about $1 billion. At the 2009 Copenhagen conference, the United States promised to provide about $100 billion a year by 2020 for climate action, and $30 billion as a Fast Start Fund. It would be sort of $30 billion initially as an installment, increasing eventually to $100 billion. In Cancun in 2010, the United States also pledged to provide additional funding, and by additional I mean funding that's not already committed to existing development projects, because there was an effort to rebrand some of the existing projects on food security, health, and so on and so forth for Bangladesh. But then, people kind of pointed out that these are already sort of things that are happening, and we need additional funding for climate change adaptation. So although the climate change has these impacts on health, food security, etc., we need sort of funding above and beyond what's already being provided, and they need to also meet up with the promises that were made in the international conferences. The UK, on the other hand, has been an exception. The British government has actually provided funding much faster for a variety of things, starting from building higher embankments to providing public health benefits and so on. So I don't know if it's because the UK Parliament somehow works better than the US Congress, but some countries are able to move faster on these issues. So we need your help to sort of make Congress work a little better on this issue.